Wyoming Territory, September 1882. Dust rolled like smoke across the dry road, the kind of wind that whispered of early frost. Dalton James had not spoken to a soul in 4 days. He preferred it that way. Silence sat easy in the saddle, and so did he. He rode alone, like always, up from the lowlands near Laramie, his saddlebags full of dry beans and cartridges. His land was 3 days past town, 18 acres of hard earth, a cabin he built with his own hands, and a barn that leaned a little west. No wife, no children, just quiet and sky. But that morning he saw her. She lay curled in the dust like a dropped doll, right off the trail beneath a cottonwood tree. Her dress was torn at the hem, her boots scuffed, and her hands cradled her belly. She was young, maybe 20 or so, and clearly pregnant. Her face was pale, lips chapped. She looked near unconscious. Dalton reined in fast, boots hitting the ground before his horse stopped moving. "Ma'am," he said, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, slow and heavy. "Water," she whispered. He slipped the canteen from his saddle and held it to her lips. She drank like she had not in days. Her breathing steadied some, but her body trembled. "Name's Dalton," he said, keeping his voice low. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Can you stand?" She tried, failed. He caught her before she hit the ground again. She was light in his arms, too light. He lifted her carefully and carried her to his horse. "I need to get you somewhere safe," he said. "My place is a few hours out. You hang on." She nodded once, eyes already drifting shut again. He got her in the saddle, propped against him, one arm tight around her. She did not speak, just breathed. They rode slow, the sun dropping behind the hills by the time they reached his cabin. He helped her down, carried her inside. The place was plain. A bed, a table, a stove, shelves lined with canned peaches and beans. He laid her on the bed and lit the lamp. She stirred as he pulled a blanket over her. "Thank you," she said faintly. Dalton sat on the edge of the bed. "What's your name?" "Zara," she said. "Zara Lowell." Her eyes met his, and something passed between them. A flicker. Something unspoken. "Where were you headed?" he asked. Her hand went to her round belly. "Anywhere but where I was." He nodded, not pressing. "You rest. I'll fix something to eat." Dalton cooked beans and cornbread, brought her a plate. She ate slowly, her hands shaking. When she finished, he brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. "You got folks?" he asked gently as he wiped the dirt from her face. "No one left," she said, voice tight. "The baby's father is gone, left before I knew I was expecting." He paused, meeting her eyes again. "You got a place to go?" Zara shook her head. "I was walking to Laramie. Thought maybe someone there would help." "You were walking?" Dalton's jaw clenched. "In your condition?" "I didn't have a choice." He looked at her, really looked. The tired edge in her voice. The way she flinched when he moved too fast. The bruises on her wrist she had not tried to hide. "You can stay here," he said. "For as long as you need." She blinked fast. "Why would you do that?" He stood, set the basin aside. "Because no one should be left in the dirt like that, especially not you." Zara turned her face into the pillow. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said. Dalton slept in the barn that night, gave her the bed. The wind howled through the trees, but he lay awake listening to every sound from the cabin. Just in case. By morning, she looked stronger. Her cheeks held a little color. She sat at the table when he came in, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You slept in the barn?" she asked. "Figured you'd sleep better that way." Zara looked down. "Thank you," he shrugged, pulling a chair out. "I got chores out back, you take it easy." But she followed him outside anyway, slow but steady. She watched as he fed the chickens, checked the fence line. She helped him peel potatoes for lunch. She laughed just once when a goat knocked over the water bucket. That sound stayed with him the rest of the day. Over the next week, she grew stronger. She helped where she could, folding linens, washing dishes, hanging herbs to dry. She was quiet but kind. And she did not ask questions about his past, which he was grateful for. Dalton had not always been alone. He had lost his younger brother in a mining collapse outside Cheyenne 5 years back. After that, he rode out to his land and never looked back. No family, no friends. Just the land and the quiet. But Zara made the cabin feel different, warmer. Like maybe it was not just a place to wait out the years. One evening, as the sun sank orange behind the hills, they sat on the front step. Zara wrapped in a shawl, her hands resting on her belly. "It kicks more at night," she said, smiling faintly. "Like it knows the day's done." Dalton watched her, that soft expression on her face. "You think it is a boy or girl?" "Feels like a girl," she said. "But maybe that is just wishful thinking," he nodded. "You got a name picked out," she hesitated. "If it is a girl, maybe Ada." Dalton smiled. "That is a good name." She looked at him then, really looked. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect? Someone who would send me on my way or take advantage?" Dalton's jaw tightened. "I would never." "I know," she said. "That is why I am still here." Their eyes held for a long moment. Something shifted between them, not rushed, not forced, just real. She reached for his hand slowly. He let her take it. Her fingers were small, warm. He held on. Neither of them said a word for the rest of the sunset. They did not need to. And for the first time in years, Dalton did not feel alone anymore. September deepened, and the cottonwoods near the creek turned yellow at the edges. Dalton stood at the fence line, hammering in a loose rail, while Zara sat on a stool near the barn, stitching the last of the baby's swaddling cloths. She'd asked for the stool herself that morning, said she wanted to help while she could still move around easy. He didn't argue, just made sure it was steady. "I used to sew in a back room above a bakery," she said, holding the fabric up to the light. "The woman who owned it let me sleep there. I paid rent with buttons and hems." Dalton set the hammer down on the fence post. "That in Colorado, Denver," she said, "before everything changed." The sky was clear, but he could smell snow somewhere far off, tucked up in the high country. He walked over and leaned against the barn wall beside her. "You think you'll go back?" he asked. She tied off the thread with a neat flick. "Not unless I had a reason." "You got one now." Zara looked up at him, eyes steady. "Maybe." He didn't press, just watched her fold the cloth into a neat square. Her hands were calmer now, less of that quiet trembling she'd carried the first few days. She moved like someone who'd begun to trust her own body again. Inside the barn, the mule brayed once. He stepped away to check on the animals, and when he came back, she was standing, rubbing her back with one hand. "You all right?" She nodded, breathing steady. "She's just heavy today." "That's all." Dalton didn't say anything. He just offered his arm, and she took it without hesitation. They walked to the porch together, her steps slow but sure. Later that evening, rain came. A soft, steady drizzle that tapped the roof like a lullaby. Zara sat by the table, shelling beans into a bowl while Dalton sharpened his skinning knife by the hearth. She glanced at him, quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you ever think about having a family?" The question hung between them for a beat longer than it needed to. "I did once," he said, not looking up, "but it didn't fit how life turned out." Zara nodded, her fingers still working through the beans. "I used to think mine was waiting for me somewhere. That I'd find it like a house with the door left open." "You still think that?" She looked toward the window where the rain streaked the glass. "I think it might not be a house. Maybe it's just a person, or a place that feels quiet enough to sleep in." Dalton looked at her then. Her face in profile, soft in the lamplight. He didn't speak, but his hand slowed on the whetstone. That night, she didn't go straight to bed. After the dishes were washed and the fire banked, she lingered by the hearth. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Course. If something happens when the baby comes, I want you to name her, or him. I want you to decide." He stood, unsure what to do with the weight of that. "Zara, I'm not asking because I think I won't make it," she said quickly. "I'm asking because I trust you." He stepped closer. "You're going to be all right." She nodded once, but her voice remained low. "Still, I want her to have a name that means something, not just one I picked alone in the dark." Dalton didn't answer right away. Then he reached for her hand, closed his around it. "All right," he said. "But we'll pick together," she exhaled, and her shoulders eased. "Thank you." He walked her to the bedroom door, but she paused before stepping inside. "Dalton." "Yeah, I don't feel like I'm just passing through anymore." He didn't say anything, just nodded, slow and sure. When the door closed behind her, he stood in the quiet for a long time, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the rain kept falling, soft and steady, like the land was trying to make something new out of the dust. The first frost came overnight, silvering the roofline and weighing the last of the summer squash flat in the garden rows. Dalton rose before the light and lit the stove, careful not to let the door creak. He cracked ice from the water bucket and poured it into the kettle, setting it to warm. In the hush of the kitchen, the only sound was the low ticking of the fire and the soft creak of floorboards above as Zara paced. By the time she came down, her face was pale and her braid loose from sleep. She moved carefully, one hand braced against the wall. He stepped forward. "What is it?" she answered through shallow breath. "Been happening off and on since last night. I didn't want to wake you." Dalton helped her into the chair by the hearth, steadying her elbow. "How far apart?" She closed her eyes for a moment. "Every half hour, maybe less now." He nodded once and knelt to check the woodpile, stacking more into the stove. "You're not going to do this alone." "I know." Her voice was quiet but steady. They spent the day in a slow rhythm. Dalton made broth and boiled linens, and when the pains grew sharper, he brought her water and pressed cool cloths to her brow. Zara didn't cry out. She gripped the edge of the bed and breathed through each wave like someone who had decided long ago to survive, no matter the shape it took. She looked up at him once, jaw clenched. "You sure you're not regretting that roadside kindness?" He folded a towel, held it out to her. "I'd do it again 100 times." Late in the evening, after the sun had faded behind the ridge and the room glowed with lamplight, the baby came. A girl, red-faced and strong-lunged. Dalton caught her with hands steadier than he expected, wrapped her in the soft cloth Zara had stitched 2 days before. He laid the child in Zara's arms, and both mother and daughter settled into the hush like they belonged to it. Zara blinked down at her. "Ada." Dalton stood near the window, one hand braced on the sill. "You sure?" "Yes." She looked over at him. "You said we'd name her together. I want her to have what's mine and what's yours." He crossed the room and sat beside her, the chair creaking under his weight. The baby's fists were curled, her breath small but certain. Zara's hand found his, warm despite her exhaustion. "I didn't think I'd live through this," she said. "You did more than live through it." She turned her head toward him. Her eyes were damp, but her voice held no tremble. "I never thought anything would feel safe again. And then you found me." Dalton didn't answer right away. He watched the firelight flicker across the floor, then looked back at her hair damp with sweat, face creased with effort, and still the most solid thing in the room. "I spent years thinking I was meant to be by myself," he said. "But now I can't imagine this place quiet again." Zara leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of the baby between them. "I want to stay," she said. "You already did." They sat that way until the fire dropped low and the wind picked up outside. No more words passed between them that night, but something even older than language settled in the room. The kind of stillness people chase their whole lives without knowing what they're looking for. Dalton moved a cot into the bedroom before dawn. He didn't return to the barn after that. There wasn't a need anymore. By late October, Snow dusted the tops of the ridges, and the mornings came sharp with cold. Dalton had finished stacking the last of the wood against the north wall, and the root cellar was nearly full. They wouldn't be riding into town again until spring, not unless something forced it. Inside, the cabin had changed. The cradle Zara built from an old apple crate sat near the hearth, lined with wool she had carded herself. Dalton had moved his tools to the barn to make room, and a row of glass jars filled with dried herbs now lined the shelf above the stove. Ada slept more often than not, bundled in a blanket Zara had sewn from scraps of her old skirts. When she was awake, her eyes followed the sound of her mother's voice, and sometimes when Dalton leaned in close enough, she wrapped a fist around the edge of his shirt like she meant to keep him still. That afternoon, Zara stood by the window, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, tying string beans for drying. The sun filtered pale through the glass, and Ada cooed softly from the cradle. "You ever think about what it would have been like," she said, "if we hadn't met out there?" Dalton took his time answering. He was smoothing the handle of a new draw knife with a scrap of oilcloth. "I try not to," he said. "Doesn't seem like it matters now." "I think about it," she said. Not in a sad way, just to remind myself how close I came to being nothing but a name someone might have passed on the road. He set the draw knife down. "You were never close to that. I would have found you one way or another." She smiled, but her eyes stayed on the beans. "I used to wonder if I'd ever be seen again. Not looked at really seen. It's different now." He crossed the room and leaned beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. Outside, a pair of crows moved across the field, wings cutting low over the stubbled grass. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. Zara sat down slowly, easing into the chair nearest the fire. "I think about spring, what she'll look like when the snow melts, how her laugh might change." Dalton nodded. "I think about fencing the back pasture. Maybe setting up a small pen for goats." She tilted her head. "You planning on staying?" He looked at her then, fully. "I figure I already have." The kettle hissed beside the stove. Zara rose and poured water into 2 tin mugs, stirring dried peppermint into one. She handed it to him, their fingers brushing. "I've been waiting to feel like I belonged somewhere again," she said. "But it's not the land, it's you." He set the mug down, steam curling between them. "I never thought I'd build anything more than a fence or a barn. Never thought I'd have someone to build it for." Zara shifted Ada to her shoulder and stood, rocking gently. The baby gave a small sigh and went quiet again. "Would you want more?" she asked. "Not soon. Just someday." Dalton moved to her side, his gaze resting on the child's soft cheek, the dark fuzz of hair against Zara's collarbone. "I would," he said, "if it was with you." Zara reached up and touched the edge of his jaw, rough from the day's work. "Then let's grow slow. Like spring under snow." That night, they sat at the table long after supper ended, her foot nudging his under the wood, his hand resting open on the tabletop. They talked of things they'd never spoken aloud, what their fathers had taught them, the mistakes they'd made, the things they still feared. He told her about the first horse he'd broken, how it had thrown him into the creek and left him limping for a week. She told him about the time she'd slept in a church loft and listened to the preacher sing hymns to an empty room. When the lamp burned low and the house fell quiet around them, Dalton stood and helped her upstairs. Ada rested in the crook of Zara's arm, her breath soft and even. As they reached the top step, Zara paused. "You know you're not alone anymore, don't you?" He looked at her steady. "I know." She leaned in and kissed him, slow and sure, her free hand curling against his chest. It wasn't rushed. Nothing between them ever had been. It was a promise, quiet and full, made in the hush of a house where nothing was taken for granted. When they lay down for the night, the cradle sat beside them, and the wind outside carried no threat. Just the sound of winter's edge, brushing against a home that would hold through every season to come. By November, the wind began to settle into its winter rhythm, low, constant, and edged with snow. The fields behind the cabin stood bare but for dry stalks, and the animals huddled closer in the barn each night. Inside, the warmth held steady. Ada had grown heavier in Zara's arms, her cheeks fuller now, her gaze fixed on every movement like she was learning the world by watching her mother's hands. Dalton had begun rising earlier, not out of necessity, but to give Zara the extra rest. He'd never said so aloud, just started bringing in water, splitting kindling and preparing bread dough before the sun reached the frost-glazed windows. He moved quieter these days, not out of caution, but care. That morning, Zara stepped out into the yard wrapped in Dalton's old coat. The sleeves hung past her hands, but it was thick and warm and she liked the weight of it. Ada rested against her chest, bundled in a wool wrap. Dalton straightened from the chicken coop when he saw her. "You sure you should be out in the cold?" "I needed air," she said. She was fussing, and I think she needed it too. He wiped his hands on his trousers, walked toward them. "I was going to take the wagon out past the ridge today. That old maple came down in the last storm. Thought I'd start cutting it for spring wood." She glanced out toward the hill. "You want company. You'd bring the baby out there, only if the weather holds," she said. "I'll keep her in the wagon. She likes the rocking." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, then. Let's load up before the sky changes its mind." They packed bread and dried meat, a jug of cider and extra blankets. Dalton hitched the mule and they rode out slow, the wagon creaking in the cold. The maple had split near the trunk, its roots half torn from the earth. Dalton set to work with the axe while Zara laid Ada in the wagon bed, wrapped snug in quilts. She sat nearby, legs tucked beneath her, and began pulling weeds from a patch of frostbitten sagebrush. Dalton paused to drink, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "You ever think about planting something more permanent out here?" Zara looked up. "Like what? Orchard maybe? Apples, pears if the ground takes." She smiled, brushing dirt from her palms. "I wouldn't mind that. You'd have to build a fence to keep the mule out." He looked toward the wagon, where Ada stirred in her sleep. "Won't be long before she's running through it." Zara's smile faded into something softer. "I like thinking about that." When they returned home, the wind had picked up, and snow began to flurry across the porch. Dalton carried the baby inside while Zara shook out the blankets. The air inside smelled of yeast, and the bread he'd set earlier had risen high above the rim of the bowl. As night came on, Zara braided her hair by the fire while Dalton carved notches into a small cedar block Ada's name and the date of her birth, clean and even. He handed it to Zara without a word. She turned it over in her hand, then looked at him. "You planning to make one every year, if you want?" "I do." That night, as they lay in bed, Zara turned toward him, her voice low. "I never told you why I left Denver. You didn't have to. I want to." He waited, listening to the wind press gently against the windows. "I was working in that bakery, doing fine enough. Then the owner's son came back from out east. He was kind at first, then he wasn't." Dalton's hand found hers under the blanket. "I tried to keep my job, but when I wouldn't give him what he wanted, he made sure I didn't have one. I left with $2 and a basket of rolls." He didn't speak, just let her finish. "I thought if I kept going, I'd outrun the way he made me feel. But I didn't, not really, not until now." Dalton kissed her forehead, slow and deliberate. "He doesn't get to touch anything here, not your name. Not your days." "I know," she said. "That's why I told you." Winter settled in firm and deep. The days came shorter, but the cabin never felt dark. Zara embroidered a quilt from scraps she'd saved. Dalton built a new cradle out of pine and lined it with fleece. They read old books by lamplight. Ada cut her first tooth and learned to roll from belly to back, and every small change felt like a victory. As February drew near, Zara stood by the window one evening, watching snow fall soft against the glass. She didn't turn when she spoke. "I don't want to leave here." "Not ever." Dalton stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "You won't have to." "I want to marry you," she said. "Not because I have to, because I want to." He rested his chin against her shoulder. "I was going to ask come spring, build something new for the day. But if you're saying now—" "I'm saying now." He turned her gently, looked into her eyes. "Then we'll wake tomorrow as husband and wife." They married in front of the hearth. No preacher, no paper, just hands joined and vows spoken over the cradle while Ada slept. Dalton slid a simple silver band onto her finger, one he'd had tucked in the bottom of his old tobacco tin for weeks. She gave him a strip of ribbon to wear around his wrist, dyed blue with indigo. Life didn't change overnight, but it rooted deeper. The days kept coming, filled with small things: mending a harness, boiling sap from the trees, teaching Ada to stand barefoot in the grass once the thaw came. Years passed. They planted the orchard. The trees bore fruit. Ada grew with dirt under her fingernails and laughter in her lungs. She called him Pa before her second birthday and never knew a time when Zara's arms weren't open. Zara stitched new curtains for the kitchen window. Dalton built a bench beneath it. They watched every sunrise together, even the cold ones, and they never needed to outrun anything again.